Welcome everyone. I'm Saeed Chaudhary. I'm the Associate Dean for Research Data Management here at the Libraries at Johns Hopkins University. I'm also leading the Open Source Programs Office here at Johns Hopkins. So for those of you who may not know, an OSPO, as we call it, Open Source Programs Office, is a construct that's been used widely in the industry to coordinate and organize open source activity within an institution. We are taking that model and adapting it to the university context. And one of the important aspects of that is thinking of open source software as a primary research object and how it can be used for education, research, and translation. And the way that we are doing that is through a layer that sits on top of the OSPO called the Institute of Applied Open Source. And that's one of the groups that is bringing this webinar to you. So I'm going to turn it over to Jacob Green to introduce our speaker today. Jacob is a fellow, I will say, JHU alumnus, and also a member of the Computer Science Advisory Board. Just a couple of logistical comments. If you could please stay on mute for obvious reasons, just for sound control, sound quality issues. And if you do have questions, feel free to put them into the chat while Justin is speaking. And then after he's finished, I will moderate any other Q&A. So you could use the raise hand function, for example, to get my attention about that. But with that, I will turn it over to Jacob.
Thank you very much, Saeed. And I wanted to extend a warm welcome to everyone today. Wanted to extend continued thanks to the Institute for Applied Open Source, the OSPO++ networks, my entire team at Moss Labs, and our legal sponsor for today at Polaro Mazza. We wanted to welcome Justin to the stage today. I think the potential for open source, for the intersection of open source communities, for Baltimore communities, and for university communities is immense. And since everything today is software, and open source is driving a lot of that, it's really heartening to find ways that we can all interface. And then, as Saeed said, through the institutional construct of the OSPO, that really needs to focus both on the legal aspects of it as well as the community aspects of it. And with that, I will introduce Justin. One of the first times I ever met Justin, we started to have immediately jumped into this noun-verb discussion about open source, both on the legal side, the human side, the community side, and we immediately started talking about the major issues in open source today. It is with that that I welcome Justin, who is currently the Director of Developer Policy Council at GitHub, as well as Senior Counsel at Microsoft, to learn a bit about Microsoft's journey in open source and some of the lessons we might learn together as our institutions go forward. Justin, welcome.
Thank you, Jacob. It's great to be here. Great to be here, everybody. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak with folks. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I'm very very happy to be here and talking about about Microsoft's journey and how that journey might be helpful for everybody else, particularly on the legal side. As Microsoft started its journey into open source, the role that was the partnership, I'd say, between the business, between the open source program office at Microsoft and the legal department, I think is one that I'm very proud of, and I think there's a lot of lessons and takeaways that could be helpful for other folks. That partnership is very important in driving, large organizational changes. So with that, there are kind of three takeaways I want people to have from our time together today. The first is just a little bit about Microsoft's organizational journey as I just described, and I'll start a little bit there with my personal story and how I came to Microsoft, because I think that's I don't usually go back in time and talk about myself, but I think it's relevant to the way that I saw Microsoft as I was joining 3.5 years ago. And then we'll really kind of get our hands dirty into the legal aspects of open source. First, with just a quick overview of the different licenses and archetypes, and then examples of what it is that we need to think about as we are, as if you're a lawyer in this space, how do you confront the issues when there are a bunch of licenses that have community practice around them and there's very little case law interpreting those things and their ambiguities? How do you get comfortable with those? So just to start out, with a little bit of my personal history, I have a degree in computer science from McGill University, and back in the early 2000s when I was in school, I really loved the idea of open source. The net was kind of just coming into kind of high speed world, for me at least, around that time. And the idea that you could collaborate kind of across the world with people and improve the software that you were working on really struck me as kind of amazing. And I think that the benefits, especially for this kind of academic audience, the benefits to open source are really, critical. It's not just kind of how do we get the open source into our organization to make money, which I think is a way a lot of for-profit businesses look at it. We can just stand on the shoulders of giants, focus on what's important. But there's also an educational aspect to open source that was really kind of critical then, through my the 10 years of my education in the 2000s. And I think that that educational aspect is the ability for anyone to kind of pull down the source code, look at it, learn from it, tinker with it, and be able to kind of build it themselves. And at that time, Microsoft wasn't really the biggest friend to that model of learning and education, at least to me, or sitting there as a student in up in Canada in Montreal, kind of putting it together kind of after the fact with the Netscape world and things like that. Microsoft just was not a friend to open source. So as I started my legal career, and there was ongoing litigation between Microsoft and some in the Linux community over patents, and there was kind of a lot of FUD, you might say, around kind of shared source and things like that. And I was always kind of tracking that throughout my. I was very kind of legally minded as a graduate student. In computer science before joining, going to law school. And so when Microsoft came to me, or the opportunity kind of got brought to my attention 3.5 years ago, my initial reaction was basically, yeah, right, Microsoft. What tricks are you trying to pull now on the open source community? But I went and I met the people there, and they were people who had been working in developer tools for a very long time at Microsoft, from the legal side supporting that business. And I met them, and they were absolutely serious about what was going on and the change that they saw Microsoft needing to make. And Microsoft, I think, learned from the past and has been embracing the future of being an open source company. And so with that, let's cut back into the presentation for a minute, and let's talk a little bit about what Microsoft is looking like now, and kind of how we got where we're going. So now we use open source everywhere. So when I first came to the company, when I was going through that interview process, my boss said, "Hey, we really need to figure out how to scale our legal services, because we need to know how to process about 10,000 new uses of open source a year. Go through our system. We need to be able to, we look at some percentage of those. We only have 4 lawyers, like 10,000 a year is really hard. We need to figure out how to scale." That 10,000 number would be great now. Now new use cases of open source at Microsoft run about 600,000 new components a month, given kind of the upgrading versions, etc. And so we need to figure out, how to clear those from a legal perspective to make sure that the licenses are all correct, et cetera. So just a vast amount of scale, really allowing us to focus on what we're doing and, you know, build on the work that other people have put into various ecosystems, and then actually, you know, learn how to support that ecosystem. And so this is a quote from Satya. You know, basically, I'd say kind of near the beginning of our journey, saying like, hey, we need to figure out how to engage so that we can focus on things that really matter and build with other people on those ideas. And so this, I'm going to show this slide, which I think is a really kind of interesting way of thinking about anyone's journey in open source, especially for a legal department engaging with open source, I would say, right? So, and you know, hat tip to Jeff McCaffer, who I think some folks know here, who put this together around the time that I joined. So level 0 is, you know, denial. You know, we just don't use open source, and I think that is something that I would say, you know, not even realistic today. You know, I was talking to a, you know, CEO of a startup recently, and they just said, yeah, the open source is table stakes. Like, we just need, like, you cannot build software without standing on the shoulders of somebody, and everybody's going to be using open source. Now, you know, frankly, you know, Microsoft at one time was a big denial about whether or not it was using open source, and, you know, going back to the early 2000s with some comments from Steve Ballmer and others. And then I think what ends up happening is people say, oh, well, but, you know, it would save us so much time and energy if we could just use a little bit of open source inside our organization. And, you know, then, you know, legal gets contacted and they kind of finally get it. They read the license and say, okay, you know, just a little bit. You can use it just a little bit, and there's no standardization. Engineers, when they try to engage with open source, it's like confused about who do we even go and talk to about whether or not we can do this. And every time anyone wants to do something, it causes a lot of organizational churn. Level 3 is the provision inbound process. I think this is how most for-profit organizations, you know, find their way to open source. And that is that, okay, like, we have a process for using open source software. There's really not that much risk to it, actually, now that we've looked at these licenses a little bit more. If we want to build on this stuff, that's great, but we have too much valuable IP in the form of patents and copyrights for us to contribute back out, you know, sorry to other people. And so there's a clear, you know, documented process. There's probably an allow list of licenses there from the legal perspective. But, you know, that getting anything out of the organization is extremely difficult. The next level is, you know, actually kind of where I think Microsoft is almost, I mean, different parts of the company are at different levels, like Windows is at one level and, you know, Azure's at another, for example. But is the idea that, well, that was great, you know, I have this dependency on, you know, some third parties' work, and now, wow, there's a problem with it, and I need to patch that problem, and now all of a sudden, you know, my version of the software is diverged from the version upstream. It's really expensive to maintain that patch set. And, you know, are the, you know, patents or copyrights that I'd be contributing back, are they really so valuable, you know, that I can't go patch it? And then, you know, you get a process in place so the engineers are empowered to do that, you know, with a pretty light touch, you know, process, with the idea that, look, like, everybody's building this core component that lots of people are using. We can all benefit from patching it together, and we get the benefit of it not being split in 35 different ways. And every time a new version gets out, or, you know, my fork is out of date and then I need to update it, so we can all build together and we get the maintenance cost shared. And then, you know, level 4 is mastery. A lot of companies never get here. We'll see if Microsoft ever does, but it's this, that, you know, you're masterful at it. You build in collaboration with everybody, the software that you work on, and maybe you have some proprietary bits you put on top in various ways or shapes or forms. But let's focus on the hard stuff, the stuff that customers really care about, and let's share maintenance on the rest. And if you look at Microsoft's journey, I mean, I think we can kind of pull out some key, some key places, right? So shared source was this idea that you can look at the source, but you can't modify it, and we're not taking patches. Back in 2001, that's the kind of denial version. Wix, which is the if you ever like install software on Windows, it's the packaged installer stuff. That came out in 2004. That was an open source project under the Microsoft reciprocal license, I think, at the time. And I think that really is a version of like, okay, you can use it, but just a little bit. And it was a great example of like a shared project, like a shared resource. There was no team in Microsoft responsible for maintaining it, but everybody thought it was valuable to have, and so different people were pitching in at various times. And I'd call it almost an inner source project, even though it was released on SourceForge. It was something that the teams themselves at Microsoft really needed to install different various packages of software onto Windows. And then I think Microsoft really started trying to engage in various ways as it took more dependencies on the inbound side. And then, it started, going through, MS Open Tech, where it's trying to figure out like, okay, what's the right way to engage, with the community on an outbound, in an outbound level. And that's kind of what Microsoft Open Tech was. We started building our own projects, TypeScript, giving the .NET ecosystem to the .NET Foundation. And then finally, the open source programs office is created right before, right around 2015, or right before 2015 starts. And that open source programs office, the role was really to try to standardize our processes around inbound, outbound, open source, and understand. The business really realized, like, look, we have these dependencies, we don't have a systematic way of dealing with it, and it's causing churn in our developer organizations. And so what is that? And then, of course, GitHub was acquired, and, I would call, I came in the company 2017. I would say that we went through a huge phase transition. Like, all these steps were kind of leading up to us being, more and more open, like open the door, open the door, open the door. The GitHub acquisition, I think, acted as a catalyst, where we went from like a phase transition, kind of all at once. Everything was kind of opened up in the company for various reasons, and now we're, continuing on that journey. So focusing on our open source programs office for a second, and what this really did was they would go out and they would interface with the various teams who have a stake in the open source ecosystem at Microsoft. Right, so there's the legal side. We're going to be focusing a lot on kind of this arrow today between the legal and OSPO. But you also think about kind of the accessibility features that you need to build in sometimes. Security is a big software supply chain security is a big talking point now, but it's something that the OSPO has always been working on as well. And then working with, I'd say the kind of open source executive council on overall strategy for the company and building out the policies that work, and then they get implemented by the open source engineering team in our developer systems, so that we can track the open source we use, we can get bill of materials out, and so forth. And so the OSPO really, what the function that it serves, at least at Microsoft, is really kind of a central location to interface with all the different stakeholders across the organization to make a one Microsoft policy, so things are easy for developers and there's not a lot of churn. And so what we end up doing is we end up publishing our our policy for using, contributing, and releasing open source, that inbound, outbound, proficiency that we talked about, so that it really is just a checklist. So instead of saying like, hey, like, is it even possible to engage with open source? You just point someone at a website, it's like, here are the steps you need to take, and here are the approvals you need in order to, use, contribute, release, like, and it's turnkey and it's supported by tooling, and it's great. So thinking a little bit about, and like turning a little bit towards how we build such policies, I like to think about everything as a stack, right? You start at the legal technical levels. I think that those are kind of a little bit more bright line than some of the other things, although we'll talk a little bit about legal and how bright line it really is later. And then the social, political, economic, and the OSPO can really serve to have that, at Microsoft in particular, we have a kind of a cross-functional teams. Like we have the technical side, those are the people who are building the tools that we use to kind of track our dependencies and engage with various ecosystems. We have the legal layer of the stack. We have our open source programs office, which drives cultural change inside the company around open source and educates people about how to engage with open source communities. And then we have an open source ecosystem team that looks at things from kind of the economic, political level inside the company and outside the company for kind of advising. We all get together every 2 weeks and talk about, how things are going and make others aware of things that are going on at the different layers of our stack in order to drive that sophistication inside the organization. And this is how I end up thinking about how to advise, at least in-house, around open source questions. So I take that stack, and you have the bright lines of legal and technical going up to social, political, economic. You'll do some custom advice a few times, how to engage with a particular community, etc. And then after you do that a few times, then you try to drive it down into commodity. How do I document that? How do I make it into a policy where I, the lawyer, don't need to engage at a heavy level, except if there's an exception to the policy, i.e., like the engineer's like, we can't possibly follow your policy and be successful. Like that's when you engage, and maybe you've discovered an edge case in your policy, and you can go back and refine it. And so the goal, it's kind of easy to do. One of the things that's great about open source is that because there's a set group of licenses with various attributes, you can kind of set it. It's pretty easy to drive things into commodity. Like if it's this type of license, this is what you do. And from a technical perspective, that kind of reinforces those policies as well. It gets harder when you're talking about the social, political, economic, and as we get into the kind of hard part of the counseling legal piece, I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like from a lawyer's perspective as you get into the kind of the fuzzy areas and how well you can set policies in those arenas. Okay. So let's move on to what is open source. This might be very not very exciting for some of the people in the room who I know have been engaged with open source for a long time, but let's drive through it. Open source, I view this as kind of open source legal 101. Okay, so starting, open source software is software under an open source license. Okay, and then that begs the question, what is a license? Well, a license at its base level is just permission. At a technical legal level, it is a defense to infringement. Let's say, Jacob or Saeed, hauled me into court and said, Justin, you infringed my open source or my license on my software. One of the things I could say in defense is like, no, I didn't. You told me I could. Right? It's just permission to do something. And to get a little bit more technical, that permission, you guys might have been thinking like, oh, it's a contract or something, right? It's usually subject to some conditions that you need to perform. Think about a driver's license. If you have permission from the state to drive your car, but you can't do things like drink and drive, speed, if you get too many points on your license, it can be revoked. If you don't meet the condition or obligations, then you lose your license. So the permissions in open source software are all the same. They're the OSI, permissions, OSI approved, the open source definition, permissions granted by the open source definition. Those are also kind of similar to the Free Software Foundation's 4 freedoms. They're the rights to use, copy, modify, and redistribute the software. You can do all of those things. Basically, take the software, do whatever you want with it, essentially. Need to meet some conditions or obligations. 2 obligations are typical of open source licenses. Well, first is you got to provide a notice, which is typically a copy of the license and any copyright statements. And the second is that you got to provide source in some cases for copyleft licenses, a term that I will get to in a second. And so, just like your driver's license, you can only use the open source software if you meet the obligations. Pretty simple. So, there are, I think, over 100 at least open source licenses out there. We're not going to go through all of them, but we can put them into 5 buckets, right? Starting at ultra permissive all the way to network copyleft. Each one of these has an increasing number of obligations that you'll need to meet, and we'll walk through these 5 archetypes. So the first is the ultra permissive. This is an example of an ultra permissive license. This is a real license. It's a parody of the GPL actually, but a real license that people put real software under. You'll note that it starts down here. This is the terms and conditions for reproducing the license itself. This is the software. Terms and conditions for copying, distribution, and modification, and it's just you do what you want, right? So this is permission in its barest form. Now, I wouldn't recommend that anyone put their software under this license, both because it's a little bit vulgar, and secondly, because it doesn't have a disclaimer of warranty. And it's likely in the United States, when you give software to somebody without a disclaimer of warranty, that the person could come back to you and say, you gave me a warranty, because that's the default rules, is that if you give somebody something that it might, software in particular, that you're likely giving them a warranty that it works as it should. So this is a liability machine, this parity license, a liability machine for people who put their software under it, though, they might say in defense, hey, like, did you really think that I was giving you a warranty with that license? But anyway. Okay. Permissive licenses, right? So the goal of somebody putting something under a permissive license is you're given maximum rights to the software, minimum obligations. The minimum obligations are typically reproduce a copy of the license and a copyright statement. Now, there's been a lot of I think a lot of people view that as people want credit for you using their software if you build it into your product. I also think that whoever, the lawyer who wrote the original of these, which I think is the MIT license, it may be the BSD license, I'm not sure, but each one of them has a disclaimer of warranty in it. And so that lawyer was thinking to themselves, I think, hey, like, my client wants to give this software away to anybody. How do I make it so my client isn't on the hook if something goes wrong? If someone puts it into a nuclear, reactor and the reactor melts down, how do I make sure that there's no liability back? Well, okay, I'll put a warranty disclaimer on the license. But what if somebody doesn't pass along that warranty disclaimer? Could it come back to my client? And so they said, well, you got to pass along a copy of the license to anybody else who you distribute the software to, so they know that, like, hey, I'm not liable for whatever this other person did to it. And you'll see some other, there's some other provisions and some licenses that say you need to, like, keep track of the changes and whatnot. And I think that's really just a lawyer thinking, like, hey, we got to avoid liability here. So the end result is, you can take the permissive component without too much problems. You put it into a product. You can put the product under whatever license you want. You just need to put those, provide that attribution of the license, etc. Now, by just got to, I mean, it's not as easy as it looks. So this is the only Latin that I use as a lawyer. I think it can be a little bit pretentious, but I love this phrase, facile dictu difficile factu. It means easy to say, difficult to do. And so this was for VS Code, I think, which obviously uses a ton of open source. This was a manually done notice file for VS Code, and it ran 1,495 pages when we stopped doing it manually. And this is not work that humans should not do. Back when these licenses were created, software was it was harder to suck in 1,000 dependencies with an npm command. Let's put it that way. So it was easier to kind of keep track of what you were using and put together such a notice file. Now that we're kind of in the modern world, it can be really difficult. At Microsoft, we've solved this problem. We literally have a button that, we keep track of all the components you're using. You click the button and you get the notice file that includes all the license information, all the copyright statements that you need, supported by an open source project at the Open Source Initiative called Clearly Defined that Microsoft worked very hard on to stand up. It's a database with license information about, it's an open database with license information about open source components. That's it. So check it out, clearlydefined.io. Okay. That brings us to Copyleft. So Copyleft is the idea that you can use licensing to preserve freedom in software. And so what do I mean by freedom in software? I mean, I think what Richard Stallman, who was the person who came up with this back in the late 80s, what I think he was really trying to drive at was the idea that if you can't look at the source code underlying your device, then you don't have control of the device has control over you. And I think that was a really kind of amazing foresight to think about as we think about that great American freedom machine, the car. Right. So, back in the day, it was like, oh no, I'm in trouble. I jump in the car, I drive away. You're Bruce Springsteen or Tracy Chapman or, whoever it is nowadays who writes those songs. You drive away and you find the new place and you get going again. Now with a software controlled vehicle with autonomous driving, who knows what's in there. You get in the car, you're in trouble, you go away, the police press a button and the doors lock and you're driven up to the police station, right? And so it's the idea that who controls the software. And so what Copyleft does is it tries to use licensing to make it so that the software you write can be stays free for other people to look at, to study, learn from, and put in their own devices. And so weak copyleft is so copyleft stretches to the extent of that the copyright will allow, essentially. So by licensing, it goes as far as it possibly can, which is a derivative work. We'll talk about that in a minute. Weak copyleft draws a brighter line. The goal when someone puts something under a weak copyleft license, like for example, like a cryptographic library, is to preserve freedom in a core set of functionality. And so the obligations that you undertake when you use something under a weak copyleft license is that you're going to need to provide attribution just like permissive, but you need to provide source code to people, some bright line of modifications to the code base. That bright line is typically, you can link against the library, or sometimes it's at the source file level, but it's a very clear line, and that's the kind of takeaway for weak copyleft, is that when you include that component in your product, you know exactly the code you need to produce. It is the code for the library that you're using, and so that others can benefit from that library and any improvements you've made to it. Okay, So copyleft, this goal again, preserve downstream freedom, and it provides source to all derivative works of a code base. What a derivative work is under copyright law for software is unknown. Any lawyer that tells you that they know definitively what a derivative work in software is, in all cases, is lying to you. There's not a lot of good case law about this problem. We can reason about it, but we frankly just don't know. It hasn't been litigated. The Free Software Foundation, who publishes the GPL, the archetype of copyleft licenses, says that it basically extends to the entire program itself that uses the work. And so that programmatic boundary is kind of what you look for. So the idea is like, hey, if you're linking against this dynamically, statically, their view is that this would be a derivative work of the code base. Network copyleft is exactly the same scope as copyleft, except that the obligations are not triggered by distribution. They're triggered by interacting with the software over a network. This was in response to the idea that there might be, or that as software moved into software as a service, how do we preserve kind of that core set of freedoms in that service? And this is the answer to that. And this is actually an interesting hot topic question. We're not going to get into this, but there's a very hot topic question in open source right now is is network copyleft enough? And you've seen a lot of open source companies with open source projects that are kind of their main project, moving away from open source licensing and into kind of like open, almost kind of like the shared source model that Microsoft had before, except maybe they'll take pull requests and that kind of thing. All right, so this slide just summarizes everything I talked about for the last few minutes. Note, I think the one thing on this slide to note is that this Eclipse public license version 1, I should have put a little question mark next to that. We will come back to that question mark in a little bit. All right. So moving on to the case law, how do we think about moving the custom advice we get down into commodity, and how comfortable are we about doing that around these licenses that really kind of fall into 5 buckets that are kind of ripe for thinking about. And we're going to focus on this idea of a derivative work as we talk about this. So again, just we need to think about the entire stack when you're giving legal advice, especially when there's not a good answer in the legal. You need to be thinking about, which I tried to do in the last segment, to say why did the person put the software under the license that they did? Right, that's a question you should be asking yourself if there's some ambiguity at the legal technical layer of what you're looking at. Do they have economic reasons for it? Are they political? Who are the people writing the software? Is it one company? Is it multiple companies? Is it a group of? Is it just some guy writing one tiny library that's holding up the rest of the ecosystem? What is it? Why were they doing it? Why did they choose the license they did? And then and so coming back to this and drawing upon your knowledge of the ecosystem, I think is really important for lawyers in this space, and meeting your clients where they are, and helping them engage with various parts if they're not as familiar with it. So let's just talk about the derivative work question. We're going to kind of focus on it in the C ecosystem. We're going to talk a little bit about what linking is, and so basically a link occurs in software when you're writing your program and you want to draw upon the work that somebody else did in a software library that performs a particular function. For simplicity, we'll call this library that I have here in orange a sorting library, right? Like you want to sort a list. Your program takes in a list of things and you want to sort it. And this library will have sort alphabetically, sort numerically, sort reverse alphabetically, et cetera, all the ways you might want to sort things. Okay, so you want to do that. What is static linking? Well, static linking is you're going along, you're executing your program. Then I say, okay, I need a sort. I write I call the sorting function. I say hey, library, here's the function Like I want to sort alphabetically, and like here's the list. And then what happens is when this program gets compiled, the compiler knows, hey, well, Justin was calling that library, so I'm going to copy that, like the particular function out of the library. I'm going to copy that function into Justin's code and like turn it into, object code, and then, continue executing. And then here at the bottom orange green boundary, the function returns me back my sorted list, and then my program can keep going with, whatever I was doing and wherever I sorted that list. Dynamic linking works differently. Dynamic linking, you have a copy of the library on your computer, and you have a copy of the program on your computer. Basically, when it's compiled, the compiler knows, hey, like, you got to link up with that library if it's present. And so what happens as the program's running, it runs, it hits this line. The processor like loads in the library, loads in that function, it executes the function, and then it returns it back to your program. The key difference between these two things from a copyright perspective, in static linking, a part of the library got copied into the program, okay? In the second one, no part of the library got copied into the program except the header, or the thing that you use to call the function name, essentially. And so there was a question, which is like, are these materially different from a derivative work perspective? Is like an interesting, legal question. And people have said, hey, like for copyleft, right? I don't need to follow the GPL if it's dynamic linking, because I haven't copied anything in my program. So my program can be like wholly separate, and I don't need to release the source code. And so like let's look at that question, because it's an interesting open question in open source law. So what you do as a lawyer, you start from first principles, you look at the definition of derivative works, and you say, okay, like, for dynamic linking and static linking, like, have I made a derivative work? Okay. So unfortunately, copyright law was written for, art, not software. And so derivative work wasn't changed when software was added. So we have things like dramatization, fictionalization, motion picture version, sound recording, any other form in which a work may be recast, transformed, or adapted. A work consisting of editorial revisions, annotations, elaborations, or other modification, which as a whole represent an original work of authorship, is a derivative work. There's not a lot of help here, is essentially where I come down. There are a bunch of analogies that I could draw. That's a lot of what lawyers do in their at least litigators, is they think about analogies to cases that the courts have already decided. But I don't see a lot there. So the next step, once you're past the statute, is to look at case law. And there are two cases that I think are pretty interesting here. The first one's the Game Genie case. And I don't think that, well, okay, I'll let this play in the background. Can people hear this?
Yes.
Street Fighter 2, more exciting. That's frustrating. Game Genie, it ain't over. So we say it's over. Excellent! Game Genie for NES, Super NES, Sega Genesis, and Game Boy. Codes from many popular games, each sold separately.
All right, so the Game Genie case, one of my favorites. Now let's put aside the copyright issue of like, was that a derivative work of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure? Let's instead focus on what was going on in the Game Genie case. So the Game Genie was a cartridge, if you couldn't figure it out from the commercial, a cartridge that you would put between a game cartridge, like let's call it Super Mario Brothers, and your Nintendo or Super Nintendo or whatever, and you'd plug that cartridge in, and the cartridge would allow you to change the registers that are operating on the Nintendo, so that you'd get things like infinite lives, the ability to jump higher, like a bunch of basically, you're just changing, certain fields in the game when it's powered up and played, and you put in the right code. And so this was unlicensed by Nintendo and Sega, etc. And so they sued, and one of the things that they sued on is say, hey, like you created an unauthorized derivative work of our games when you've changed it so that the game itself, there's infinite lives or whatever, the cheat codes that you put in. And the court held that it was not a derivative work, or the Game Genie wasn't creating derivative work when it was playing the game. And the reason for that was that there was no copying of the game by Game Genie at all. All Game Genie was doing was it's like a filter or a lens through which you could, look at the, change the way the game was perceived, but that didn't actually create a derivative work. The analogy, one of the analogies the court did is like, look, like if I hand out rose-colored glasses at a movie theater, I haven't created derivative work of the movie when people go and watch it, right? It's just like, yeah, it's changed a little bit, but it's not a material change. And part of it is I haven't made an actual copy of the game itself. So this case people often cite for the proposition that, hey, you can't make a derivative work of software if you haven't actually copied the software itself into your program. And so that leads to the conclusion under as we think back to dynamic or static linking, maybe that's a derivative work. Dynamic linking, where you're not actually making the copy, maybe it's not a derivative work. But and by the way, this case, 1992, came out the year after the GPL version 2 was published, and so was a way that a lot of lawyers, to the extent lawyers were analyzing the GPL back then, was a way that a lot of lawyers were thinking about the GPL right when it came out. But let's now talk about a different video game case. Like I said, we don't have great case law here. So this is the Duke Nukem case. I'm just going to leave it playing in the background for folks. This is, just for a feel of what the game is. Basically a first-person shooter game. Run around, get guns, body armor, go kill bad guys or whatever. And so the Duke Nukem gave you the ability to build your own levels. And the license on that level editor said, anything you create with this can only be used, for non-commercial use, basically. No commercial use of the levels that come out of it. And then it came out in map files, and the map file was just, basically a bitmap that told the computer how to lay out the level. Right, or told Duke Nukem how to lay out the level. You'd have something that meant wall, something that meant body armor, something that meant bad guy, and then the computer would take in that file, process it, and form the level. So of course, it being the 90s and kind of the Wild West days, some company went around. I think it was FormGen, went around and like grabbed every single Duke Nukem level that it could off all the bulletin boards and made a DVD that sell to people called Duke Nukem: The Lost Levels. And so they got sued, and one of their defenses, one of the things was, hey, like you've made a derivative work of our game. And their response was, no, we didn't. We took these map levels. We made no copy of any part of your game whatsoever. This is just a bitmap file. And think about that Game Genie case. We made no copy, so we could not have made a derivative work of your game. And the court said, well, actually, that's not quite right. And the court said for two reasons. The first reason is that the only thing that these map files would be good for is to be played on Duke Nukem. So like the fact that there's a tightness of integration essentially between the map file and Duke Nukem. It's not like you could take this map file and put it into another game like Street Fighter or whatever, and that game would know what to do with that map file. There's no kind of standard way of doing that. And there's a footnote 5, where the court says, if it was really standardized, if this interface between the coupling between the map file and the video game was really standardized, like for like all the video games, it could be used in several different games, several different ways, then maybe would have a different result here. But it's the kind of uniqueness and tightness of integration that matter. And the court also said, well, they also just made a sequel to Duke Nukem, and like a sequel is clearly a derivative work. So that's it. And so, but those two pieces of reasoning are very interesting and kind of lead to the conclusion that, hey, like if your program was designed to be made with that particular library and it's not some other library, then that would tend to the conclusion that there is a derivative work in that piece of code when you use it with a library. Some other considerations are, this case that was reported, it's a district court case, so less important to lawyers than courts of appeals cases. Progress Software, they kind of looked exactly at this dynamic linking issue. But on it's a quick look because it was for a preliminary injunction, and the court basically said, I think in a throwaway line, I think MySQL probably has the better argument here. That's it. Like, hey, it's dynamically linked. I think MySQL is the better argument. They don't say why, they just say it. And then there's the Oracle v. Google case, which actually there's now a Supreme Court case, but that Supreme Court case doesn't change the Federal Circuit opinion, although it casts it in a very different light, where the header itself, the list of function calls might be copyrightable as well. Leading to the idea hey, you've actually copied a little something that's copyrightable when you use that interface to interact with the library. So maybe that Game Genie bright line of hey, I didn't copy anything, maybe that's not even true. And so the other thing I'd kind of point out is that in litigation, judges look a lot at the equities, and then especially in copyright law, a big question I think courts are asking is who's being naughty. And so litigating, especially if it's a nonprofit on the other side, it's a tough call to it's the Free Software Foundation says dynamic linking creates a derivative work, full stop. Or we think it probably does. They don't say, they're not giving you legal advice. But if you were litigating against them, do you really want to be if they gave you software, told you what the terms were, told you couldn't do something, and then you did it anyway? It's and falling back on technical arguments before a judge who's probably not technical. That's a hard row to hoe. Okay, so let's harken back to that open source stack and what happens when things get a little bit fuzzy around derivative works. Do we need to climb the stack? Let's look at the Eclipse Public License version 1. That people call that a weak copyleft license. It's very widely used in the Java ecosystem, and the essential takeaway is hey, if you have a binary library and you dynamically link against that binary library, it probably the source disclosure, just go to that binary library, the jar file itself. It doesn't extend beyond the jar file. That's the common understanding in the world about that. So. But what the license actually says is copyleft extends to changes or additions to the program, but does not extend to additions to the program which are separate modules, right? And are not derivative works of the program. So what the sum of this language is if it is a derivative work, then copyleft extends to it. If your modification is a derivative work, then copyleft extends to it. Okay, so does that mean the Eclipse public license, we need to do the same analysis we did dynamic linking against those jar files? Is the common understanding wrong? Well, let's ask the Eclipse Foundation. They're the license steward. They just punt it and say, it's whatever it is under US law. That's great. Well, let's go to TLDR Legal. TLDR Legal has a quick summary that says allows you to link code to the license to proprietary applications. Well, if the Eclipse Foundation wasn't willing to say that, why is TLDR Legal willing to do it? There's a green check mark there. That means that it's been reviewed by a fancy lawyer at a fancy law firm. And why would that fancy lawyer feel comfortable with this? And the answer is that you need to think about the rest of the stack. It's the reason they're comfortable with this is that everybody else has been treating that license this way forever. And that's the way the ecosystem has worked. And for it to kind of suddenly change would be surprising, shocking, and from a legal perspective, you're blocking your clients on a technical argument that doesn't carry much risk. And so yeah, sure, somebody could make the argument that, yeah, it's a derivative work and, dynamic static linking, et cetera. But nobody's done that in the 20 years of the Eclipse public license, number one. Number two, everybody who's been putting it under a license has assumed that it stops at the edge of the jar file. So let's not worry about it. Let's move on. So you got to give practical advice in fuzzy worlds. As a lawyer, and especially around here, you need to be thinking about that full stack. Is the kind of takeaway that I'm hoping to leave you with. And with that, this is the notice file for my presentation. That first piece with the puzzle pieces. It's great. I think a great illustration of what we try to do in open source at Microsoft, get the puzzle to fit properly. And with that, I'll leave us with questions.
Justin, thanks so much. That was really incredible. I learned a tremendous amount. My neurons are on overload, so thank you for that. To that, want to thank all of you for participating. Certainly want to thank Justin. One final comment from me though, Justin, your slide about maturity model for open source, you can substitute source with data. And we've had a 20-year journey in universities around that. I hope it doesn't take us that long in software. And I think your presentation is one of the things that can help accelerate us deal with software in a much faster way. So we will have follow-up through the OSPO++ network as well. So please, I encourage you to participate in follow-up events there. And again, thank you everyone. I appreciate it, and hope you have a good rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone.